So, good morning, everyone. As you might have figured, if you watch these satsangs regularly, the message is more or less consistent, and I tend to repeat the same thing, but we have the opportunity to go in a little deeper because this is a progressive set of satsangs for this weekend. So that's the benefit of a weekend intensive versus standalones. But to keep everything on track, because our mind tends to want to go off in all sorts of directions, it's good to have a little recap. And the starting point of this teaching suggests that we keep this question very much in mind. The most important question, if we find ourselves seekers, could be this question, because the tendency when seeking happens is that sometimes we find ourselves seeking and seeking and seeking and seeking, and it doesn't stop. And that first seeking can be fun. It's an exploration into a whole new dimension of life that we mightn't have explored before. And then at some point, it can start to become frustrating and depressing if what our efforts aren't delivering something. And sometimes it's not delivering because we haven't actually stopped and asked the question, a very clear question to ourselves: what am I really looking for? And in answering the question, it's good to drop all concepts, meaning drop any ideas that we have about what we're seeking, drop any ideas that we've been told about what we're seeking, and treat it as a really practical exploration that we're going to find out for ourselves. And so this question, what am I really seeking, needs an answer from our own present moment investigation, not an answer that has been given to me. And having said that, I'm going to suggest an answer to the question. But the suggestion, the answer, is not so that it just becomes the answer, but it becomes an answer you want to find out and tick for yourself. What am I really looking for? And the answer is happiness. The suggested answer in the conceptual framework. That means that if I drop any idea about what I'm seeking, I go, actually, really, why am I seeking enlightenment, let's say? Why am I seeking a soulmate? Why am I seeking anything in life? I'm seeking it because I believe it's going to make me happy. So we can say, actually, all I want is to be happy. So what is human happiness? Because if we are seeking happiness, but we seek the wrong thing, then we can spend years seeking happiness but looking in the wrong place. And from our own investigation, looking at our own habits and tendencies and movements and attachments, we might come to see that, my definition of happiness, what I believe happiness to be, is happiness through pleasure, happiness through outcomes. And so I'm seeking circumstance, I'm seeking outcomes. Essentially, I'm seeking pleasure because I believe that's where my happiness is going to be found. So we are seeking happiness, but we've got a misguided idea of what happiness is and where it's to be found. It turns out that happiness for the human being is not to be found in outcomes, not to be found in circumstance, not to be found in pleasure. So all of those words are different words for the same thing. Outcomes, circumstance, pleasure. Some circumstance can be pain, obviously, pleasure or pain. But we believe that our happiness is to be found in just pleasurable outcomes. So happiness for the human being turns out to be found not in circumstance or pleasure, but rather in our attitude to circumstance, our attitude to the pleasure or pain. Which means our happiness is not circumstantial, but attitudinal. And the attitude that we have as humans is either an attitude that brings about suffering, or an attitude which brings about the end of suffering. And the end of suffering we can call peace of mind. The presence of suffering is very much the opposite of peace of mind. And we'll come to look at the different forms of suffering and why we can say that suffering is the opposite of peace of mind. So, what am I really looking for? I am looking for happiness. What is happiness for the human being? Happiness for the human being turns out to be continuous, unbroken peace of mind, regardless of the circumstance that we find ourselves in. Now, circumstance, or another word in this teaching, is the flow of life. So the flow of life means the circumstance that is ever-changing. You know, you walk past a nice rose bush and smell the roses. That's the flow of life in the moment. And so the flow of life when you smell the rose bush is pleasure in the moment, assuming you like the smell of the rose. If the rose doesn't smell nice, then that's pain in the moment. If there's a bee in the rose and it stings your nose, that's pain in the moment. All of that is the flow of life. And the flow of life is either pleasure or pain. So if a dog comes up and nips at your ankle while you're smelling the rose, just like the bee stinging you, that's part of the flow of life, and it's either pleasure or pain. If it starts raining and you've just had your hair done and you're wearing some clothes and you're off to a party and it starts raining really heavily, that's the flow of life, and relative to your biological preferences, it's either pleasurable or painful. And the flow of life, however you look at it, in any moment, from the moment you're born to the moment you'll die, is only ever pleasure or pain. And the concept is that our happiness is not dependent on pleasure or pain. Meaning that the flow of life is not what makes us happy or sad. The fact that it starts raining after you've done your hair and you're going out to a party and you're getting wet, pain in the moment, that's circumstantial. My happiness or unhappiness has to do with my attitude to what is happening. If I have a certain attitude, I can find myself experiencing pain in the moment and yet be at peace. And that peace with the situation as it stands turns out to be all we're looking for. To the extent that we find ourselves at peace on a continuous basis, we know that we are happy, that's our experience, and we know that we want nothing more. And so this attitude to the flow of life is not something we have to convince ourselves about. We don't have to convince ourselves that this situation is okay. It's not a new belief system. Once the old belief system that life has put in place that says this is not okay, this is an attack on who I am, which is based on an idea of who I am, a belief of who I am which is inaccurate. Once that falls away, what we find is that we are present in life, pleasure sometimes, pain at others, and there is a natural peace, a peace that emanates from our true nature that is not being interfered with by this false idea of who I am. If the peace that I'm talking about is a mental overlay onto life, then that would be hard work. That would mean that each time that life turned out to be painful or pleasurable, I'd have to interpret that. I'd have to have a mental idea of it being okay. But it turns out that our true nature is okay with life being pleasurable or painful because it's always complete. It's unaffected by what happens in the flow of life. So what I'm talking about, our true nature, I'm talking about the essence of the human being. And the human being, according to these concepts, is said to be the impersonal consciousness of Source that is linked and identified to a particular body, a vehicle we could say, and once it connects to that body and vehicle, it springs into a new form which we can call personal consciousness. So personal consciousness is the experience you're having right now. This doesn't have to remain a concept, an abstraction, a mental abstraction. If we go to the very experience that you're having right now, be aware of the experience as it is. Be aware of seeing me, or if you've got your eyes closed, the emptiness, the vastness, maybe the presence of some thinking. That's personal consciousness. Personal consciousness effectively means the life experience from the perspective of a particular body-mind organism, particular person. So in each moment as we go through life, the experience that we have is a personal consciousness experience. And that personal consciousness experience only exists because impersonal consciousness of Source is illuminating the body.
So we don't actually have to go through life wanting anything to be different from the perspective of the preferences that are in the body. I mean, there's biological preferences, and according to those, some things are painful and some things are pleasurable, and so one doesn't have to manipulate those preferences at all. They'll be there, and some things will be painful and some things will be pleasurable, but behind that, even in the pain, there's a peace.
Mm-hmm. So that's exactly it. If we see that there's the biological aspect of the human being, and the biological aspect of the human being will have its biological preferences. And that means that the flow of life will be biologically pleasurable or painful. Then there is the non-biological aspect of the human being, which doesn't actually ever arise independent of the biological. The human being is always the combination, the package. But it's very important that awareness lands on the non-biological aspect of the human being. Because for our whole life there has been an identification solely with the biological aspect. So what I am is essentially believed to be limited to the physical and the emotional. The non-biological aspect of the human, which is the most significant part in a sense, and I say that with a grain of salt because there isn't, it's like a car with a motor, and we might say the motor is the most significant thing of the car. But, someone just drops a motor on your driveway, it's useless. Similarly, if someone just drops the body of the car on your driveway without a motor in it, it's useless. If you have the body and the motor but no petrol, it's useless. So they never work independent of each other, but this is a very significant aspect, this formless essence of the human being, the personal consciousness, the consciousness aspect of the human being. And strangely enough, even though it's ever present, and the component of the human that is aware of life is the consciousness, it's unrecognized by the consciousness itself. And what is recognized is the biological aspect of the human being. And so if we know ourselves only as the biological, then the biological, in a sense, is attacked or added to by the flow of life. The flow of life is either pleasure or pain. And so if we only know ourselves as the biological, that's why we believe, oh, my completeness, my happiness is to be found in pleasure, 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 pleasure. And when life inevitably delivers pain, it feels like an attack on who I am. To the extent we come to know the non-biological aspect of the human, what it means by knowing it means being it. And the more often we are able to rest in that ground of being, the more we'll have first-hand evidence that says, even in the face of the rain pouring down on me, when I was hoping to, not get wet, I am. It's not a mental thought that regardless of the rain, I am. We rest into being, and we are. And so we can rest there knowing that we're complete, being complete. And then the idea that this is an attack on who I am starts to be seen that it was just a belief system, just an attitude to life that isn't actually supported by my own being, meaning being grounded into that formless essence of the human. And what sometimes keeps us away from dropping into being is the incessant thinking that happens, that is always assessing life based on how we've come to see life. So that's why we're often told in certain teachings to just stop. And if the thinking is still happening, to the extent that we come to realize that this obsessive thinking isn't getting me what I really want, what I really need. What I really want and really need is to be found in this dimension that is outside of the obsessive thinking. If we really learn this, whenever awareness lands on the obsessive thinking that we register as obsessive thinking, trying to get happiness in the future, in outcomes, a thought can just arise, stop. And if we know that that thinking is useless, it's worthless, then stop means something. Stop can actually stop the thinking. But to the extent that we think that that thinking is valuable, that the more I think about what I need in the future, the more I think about what happened in the past that someone did to me or regrets, to the extent we think that that is actually helpful to me, we won't be able to stop. It won't make sense to stop. So stop. One sec.
I'm wondering, I know Eckhart Tolle.
If you, just for the recording purpose, if you just hold the button for a second.
I know Eckhart Tolle had like a moment of despair before he became who he is now.
He had a life of despair before it.
Huh?
He had a life of despair before
Right,
His-
right. In a moment of just yeah, existential, whatever. Yeah, I think he was even suicidal. I read it at the time. And then he went on to become such a fantastic influence. I'm curious, was there a time when your life was a disaster in terms of your attitude towards it, like you're talking about? And then you somehow shifted to this attitude and things changed miraculously? I would love to hear how your life has illustrated these ideas that you're sharing.
Yeah, I sometimes mention that, although I can imagine that it can be annoying to hear the fact that my life was always relatively free of suffering. So my genes and up-to-date conditioning, which I'm not in control of, that's part of the core of this teaching, which is what makes us who we are on a biological level. My genes and up-to-date conditioning didn't include very dense forms of these beliefs in doership. So from a young age, when I look back, there was something in me that knew when I was feeling upset about circumstance, something in me would always sort of reposition me and say, oh, how am I looking at this wrong? How can I change how I'm looking at this, rather than putting a lot of effort into controlling the situation? And blame and guilt and depression or anxiety weren't experiences that I was particularly familiar with. Along the way, I've had little sort of samples of them, which I think life has put in place so that I have a empathy and an understanding of what anxiety feels like 10-second bursts of just despair. So I've had a sense of it, and I think life has done that just so that I can understand these forms of suffering that I didn't have as my own experience. And there are two ways. Either we break through, there's a breakthrough because there's a desperation, because of our current way of seeing life and the uncomfortableness that comes with that. Or there's a progression that happens over time that has already dissolved a lot of the mistaken beliefs in the past, let's say. And so then our experience is one that doesn't have a very strong veil covering it. The obstacles are not that great. And so in my experience, when I started reading books that were pointing at this, it was like, yes, of course, why haven't I come across these books before? And the books weren't delivering intellectual knowledge. Well, they were. Anything written down is a concept that is going to be received by the intellect. But the intellect then started looking around at life to confirm what was being said. And that's how a spiritual teaching is most effectively used, when it doesn't become a belief system, but rather becomes a pointer as to what to investigate, what to see. And as we spoke about yesterday, although I don't think you were here yesterday, the investigation itself is not something that you as a separate independent entity are doing, but rather it's something that happens based on who you are in a particular moment. So a concept that is put forward today is new conditioning, and that new conditioning can alter your up-to-date conditioning or become part of your up-to-date conditioning. And then as you find yourself moving through life, so one of the concepts is that one of the forms of suffering is blame. Blaming the other for what we see they have done as a separate independent entity that has delivered pain to me. And so that's a concept that has been delivered. It's new conditioning. And that new conditioning can add to your up-to-date conditioning. And another of the concepts is that in each moment, whatever happens through us, our thoughts, our feelings, our actions, our words, are a result of who we are in that moment. And who we are in that moment on a biological level is based on these two factors, our genes and up-to-date conditioning that we've had no control over. And so life is continually changing our up-to-date conditioning, which then means you go out into life and someone might do something that is painful to you. A reaction inside happens of blame, and as a result of the circumstance being the way it is, someone did something that is painful, blame arising, and then awareness becomes aware of the blame, and a thought arises. This is blame in the moment. That is an attitude based on the pain I'm experiencing that the other has delivered to me. And so that thought is the sort of thought that we tend to claim as me. My thought, I am thinking this. When we start to look at it more objectively, we find this is a thought that is happening. Not my doing, but a thought that has to arise based on the circumstance that I had no control over and my genes and up-to-date conditioning. So had you not been exposed to these new concepts, which is new conditioning, the blame would have been there, and the thought, oh, this is blame, which is a form of suffering, as a result of my attitude, that thought wouldn't arise. And so the investigation that happens, the inquiry that happens, at some point we might witness it happening and realize this is not my doing. This is a happening like everything else in life. Does that make sense?
It does. I liked hearing that there are certain leaders, spiritual leaders, who didn't come to it through disaster. People who were sort of blessed in a way from a very young age. So I guess you're in that category. I think Dalai Lama may be one of them, and there are others.
Well, I'm not putting myself in any category, because but
that's the first thing that popped into my mind.
that's a very nice comparison. And there's a reason why the way I see it is that this is a story, a creation, and it's a creation that is created to follow a cause and effect pattern. And there is the memory that I have in this present moment of being a young child. So the way this experience, this story is created is as if there was a past. Now there may be a past. I can't really confirm that when I'm just present with what is now. I know there is a memory of the past, and what I've also experienced, and many people experience, is memories that I can't understand based on what has happened in my life. I have memories of being Roger, and then I have had memories of events that don't include Roger, but have another protagonist, another main character at the center of the event, the center of the memory. So that's what people would call past lives. And in the past life memories that I've had, some of them have included people that were living a life focused on inquiry and investigation. One was, let's say, a Buddhist monk that was very old and was a mentor to many monks in this monastery. And his realization at the age of 90-something, where he was close to death, was, wow, this understanding that has happened throughout his life is an understanding that needs to be taken into daily living. And had he had this realization when he was much younger, he would have hung up his robes and gone off into daily life. And the monk in this memory that I somehow had access to realized, if I live again, my understanding will take me out of monastic life into daily living. And so the way I see it is that Roger has never lived a past life. Roger will never live a future life. But there were other lives. And somehow the other lives tend to have a link into this life. And so the unresolved fears and desires on the downside, let's say, that existed in past lives can be brought forward into an existing life. It's just the data, just the unresolved fears and desires, but also insights that have happened. So the understanding that has happened in past lives can be brought forward into a present life. And so the way I look at it is that Roger is just a life in a progression, let's say, or in a line of other lives where a lot of work was done in the other. So it's not like I haven't done anything, I haven't achieved anything. It's just that this story of life now doesn't include that much misunderstanding. So when I found myself seeking, what I was reading resonated. It made sense. I can't explain why it made sense, except on this basis. I can't explain why, as a young person, I tended to find myself quite solitary, not so interested in getting too involved in pleasures, not thinking that they were my happiness. And also when things didn't go right, I can't explain why my attitude was to look at not the circumstance, but my attitude as the solution. I can't explain it except along the lines that I've just did. That there is, in this story of life, a progression of lives. That's my experience anyway. I'm not saying it is absolutely. But what's important is to know that Roger didn't live a past life. Roger is a result of the impersonal consciousness of Source functioning through this particular body-mind organism that has its unique programming. And when Roger dies, it means the body dies and is burnt or buried. So the body no longer exists. So there's no potential for Roger to still exist. So the essence that functions through all of us is impersonal. The essence that functions through all of us doesn't have personality or age or gender, doesn't have preferences. What it is the impersonal consciousness of Source that has the function of awareness and the impersonal sense of I am. And then when that impersonal awareness and I am functions through the body, it's colored by all of the aspects of the body. So that's where Rogerness comes into existence, or Roger, the personal consciousness experience, comes into existence because this unique body is there. So when this body dies, the consciousness is not affected by the death of the body, but the consciousness that's not affected has no personal characteristics. So a bit like white light going through a red filter, and what comes out the other side is red light. So we know that the essence of the red light is white light. The red filter can be seen as the body or the vehicle that colors the white light and turns it into red light, and the red light would be the personal consciousness experience. So at the time when the filter is destroyed, when the red filter no longer exists, there's no question of red light existing. But the white light is unaffected. And so the white light can then flow through, can identify and function through another filter, a green filter, for example. And that will create green light. And how something from a past life gets put into this life is that it gets put into the filter. It becomes part of the filter. So some information from a past filter, an attitudinal aspect, so it's not a biological aspect of the human being, but an attitudinal aspect from a past life is stored when the human being dies as data, not a soul, but just data. And then that data some of it is inserted into the new body and becomes part of the predisposition of that particular human. And that data we can call part of the beliefs in personal doership and attachment to outcomes, which is our attitude that creates suffering. And in time, the process will start to undo those beliefs by showing them to be inaccurate. And so any unresolved desires or fears from past lives eventually get undone in a present life.
I guess having a teacher, because a lot of the things you're saying I've read already, but I guess it's quite important to have all these great spiritual teachers to, it's like a reminder. It's not like it hasn't been said or discovered, but I guess it's just important to have like a shepherd of some kind.
Yes, that's the role that a teacher plays. They're not actually giving you anything other than pointers. So a teacher doesn't bestow something upon you. They just point.
Bring that to you? Or you will? Thank you. I just want to do that. Thank you. And thank you. That was a great answer. Appreciate it.
You're welcome.
There you go.
Thanks. Hi.
Hello.
So I was listening to a lot of the Satsangs on YouTube, and I was trying then to take everything that I was listening to, and I'm saying I was, but I know it's not me, but the process was updating the conditioning, and I would see that what would happen and what is happening, and I'm just checking with you because I haven't had a chance to see if it's integrated correctly or whatever, would be I would notice the uncomfortableness in my body. I mean, even this morning. I would start to find, the mind would start to scan for a problem. So I could put it on that. Mm-hmm. And a story would maybe start. And then I would, there's blame in that story. Or there's a belief someone else has done something, or I should have done something better. Mm-hmm. And then that story stopped. And as that, and then the pride, like even, maybe you can clarify when you said last night that Ramesh would say we're God's favorites, the pride might come in and say, like, and that's not, I'm sure, what he meant at all.
No, that's right. He didn't mean that.
So,
it just meant that our destiny happens to have us in satsang. And so satsang is where this new conditioning is delivered. And so completely impersonal. It's not because someone deserves to be God. You just look at your circumstance, your situation, and you say, wow, I spent Friday night, Saturday, and maybe even Sunday in satsang. That was my destiny. And so that's what he meant, is that it's your destiny to be in a position, in a situation where concepts that potentially can bring about an end of suffering are being delivered. And so then we just say, wow, what luck. So life is really luck. It's a story that's been written, and we find ourselves in the story, either good luck or bad luck.
okay, that makes good sense. Because I was thinking it has to be more for like a gratitude, so. Mm-hmm. Okay, so that covers 3 of the 5. The shame or self-blame, the doership part, the belief in a doer. Mm-hmm. And then the other 2 are the worry and anxiety. And I see that as still something I'm struggling with, because the future, mine wants to then go out to the future and think it can do something. about anything
Yeah,
and plan.
thinking it can control what is essentially like an avalanche coming down a mountain. That is, the flow of life is like that. It has a life of its own, and we are here going, move a little to the left, please, a little to the right, thinking that I can actually control the avalanche. Instead of surrender, this is the thing, is if we hear these concepts and the doer in us hears them, the part that is still convinced that its happiness, its completeness is to be found in pleasure, 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 and that it is the doer. If it hears these concepts, it sounds like terrible news. Like, you mean I can't control life and I'm not the doer? This is terrible news. But the good news is the part that says our happiness is not to be found in pleasure or pain, not to be found in the flow of life. So that's great news, because we go, oh, so I don't need to worry about controlling the flow of life. To the extent we still believe our happiness is to be found in the flow of life, then it's going to sound terrible. It's almost like being told, oh, well, you're going to get pain sometimes. And that's not acceptable. Once we know from our own experience even better, but even intellectually, once we understand intellectually, my happiness isn't to be found in pleasure or pain. So then pleasure or pain can be there, and it means much less than it did when the belief was there that my happiness is to be found in pleasure, pleasure, pleasure. So that's the important part, is to really come to see, and then first intellectually, and as the intellectual understanding goes deeper and deeper, come to know from our own experience that even when it's painful, when the flow of life is painful, I exist. And the more that's known, the less that worry and anxiety has a foundation on which to arise. The less chance there is of us having expectations in the future, because an expectation is effectively a fantasy about how that avalanche in a particular moment is going to look. And the avalanche is so dynamic and moving so fast, there's no way that we're going to know what it's going to look like in a particular moment in the future. And having an expectation is effectively having an imagination that I know what the flow of life is going to look like, and I'm going to make it happen that way. So then we spend time thinking, effort, for hours about how I'm going to achieve this, planning. Now, there's nothing wrong with planning. If you've got a business, for example, you need to do some planning, and you need to imagine a future. That's okay, do what you need to do, planning, but to the extent that your planning becomes obsessive and you're actually thinking and thinking and thinking and realizing that the thinking is not constructive, efficient thinking about an action plan. It's fantasy. Then we realize, that's expectation. It's a form of suffering that prevents us from being, from feeling complete in the moment. And then that starts getting cut off. And attachment to outcomes is a form of suffering that arises when an outcome turns out to be negative. So, for example, when the rain falls on us and we don't want it to fall on us, the feeling that, the pleasure I was going to get by turning up at the party in my best dress or best suit or whatever, with my new hairstyle, that pleasure is gone because, let's say, we get soaked. And attachment to outcome is this feeling inside of almost despair or unacceptability with what is happening. And though instead of laughing, let's say, not to say that laughing is a solution to pain in the moment, but when we look at the pain in the moment of getting rained on, it's actually not that terrible. And so we might laugh at the fact like, this is obviously destiny in this moment and always was. So the suggestion I'm putting forward is that we can start to look at life as a creation. created from the beginning of time to the end of time, and each moment is unfolding exactly as it's created, like a storybook. And to the extent that we surrender our will, that means the collapsing of the me that causes all of our grief in life. And grief, I'm talking about suffering. To the extent that we surrender that will, the appreciation for life as a creation can happen. Now, to the doer, the doer is not interested in hearing that life is a creation because it takes away its existence. But a surrender to that may mean that there is something far more wonderful that's available in life. Wonderful not through winning and succeeding, which is what the doer wants to do, but wonderful at being one with the creation. It's not at all something that the mind can imagine. The mind has its idea about what success is, what happiness is, what in life, and it's wrong.
So the I am part that you mentioned, how when these pointers can cut off the suffering or the thinking about it, then you can drop into the I am.
Mm-hmm.
At first I didn't understand what that meant, and then it started to kind of happen.
Mm-hmm.
And then it was easier for me from that peaceful place to realize when something was actually starting to feel shaking again. I was like, before that I couldn't spot it. It was like all kind of like that.
Mm-hmm.
But the I am part, that gets back to what the question before about, well, I don't know. She just brought up Eckhart Tolle, but that power of now and all of that. The I am and the now seem identical.
Mm-hmm.
And so being in that, there's no, obviously, it's complete and there's no issue. So knowing that and having felt that, it hurts 10,000 times more to get out of that or to find yourself out of that somewhere else. Like, I feel desperate for it back, but yet I know that's also not true.
That's more suffering, right? So to the extent that we see the desperation when we find ourselves back into suffering, which is the flop. So we have this flip-flop phase that happens. The flip is when we find ourselves at peace and it feels like, it's happened. This is it. And then the next day, everything's different again. And the suffering is there. And that's the flop. And there's a very important purpose for this flip-flopping. Why it happens is because the ingrained beliefs are getting weaker. And because they're getting weaker, there are periods where they're not being activated or triggered by life. But because they're getting weaker and they haven't necessarily completely dissolved, then there's going to be a period that follows the peace that is back into the suffering. So that's why the flip-flopping happens, because the beliefs are getting weaker, but they haven't been completely dissolved yet. And life is taking us down a path, and it's a path of inquiry and transformation. So we don't need to really worry. When I say we don't need to worry, we'll either worry or we won't, depending on how that moment is created to be. To the extent the understanding gets deeper and deeper, we'll realize for ourselves, it's happening. I can see it in my own life experience, that the understanding is happening, the seeking is happening. And so at some point we relax and go, I've never been the doer. No one has ever been the doer. The doer is an attitude to life which is incorrect. Life has always been happening. What I see happening is the seeking process. What I see happening is insight. What I see happening is more peace. So I can relax. The mind might think if you relax, it's going to stop happening. Relaxing is actually it happening more, because relaxing is the doer letting go, which is actually the process happening.
So last night you ended kind of on the idea of shoulds and shouldn'ts and living in the moment, and how you said on the surface everything looks cause and effect in space and time and space, but that it's really actually a spontaneous arising.
Mm-hmm.
Is that when you get deeper into the now that you...
Well, actually, let me correct that, because I said on the surface, well, I probably said what you said, but I'd like to rephrase it. On the surface, life is a story of cause and effect. When we see the fundamental nature of life, we come to see that at its root, the cause and effect principle doesn't apply, and that it's much more a spontaneous creation. And that isn't intended to get us to deny the surface experience. The surface experience will always be an experience of time and space and cause and effect. And the deep understanding is not to see the surface as illusion and only see the fundamental nature as reality, but to be able to see life as a paradox and hold the two together. So hold life as a spontaneous creation, see life as a spontaneous creation, but what is created is a creation of time and space, cause and effect. So not to deny one or the other. They seem like opposites at first, as contradictions, but if we can hold them as complementaries, as paradoxes, then that's the understanding. When we only see life as, on the surface, cause and effect, what effectively happens is what when Ritu asked the question, and I was pointing out the fact that we only know ourselves as the biological and not the essence. We come to know only the surface, cause and effect, and we treat that as truth. And it isn't quite like that. So, presence, the now, is to stop believing life to be as we have believed it to be, and to start opening to the fact that it's a little bit more complex. And the shoulds and shouldn'ts that have been set up by life that tell us, I should do this, I shouldn't do that, you should do this, you shouldn't do that, is basically us trying to control life in order for it to be pleasure, 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 pleasure. And the deepest pleasure that we're craving, that we're attached to, is love. So really, deep down, we believe that my completeness and my happiness is to be found in love from the other. And so many of the shoulds and shouldn'ts, when we look at them, are strategies to be able to get as much love from the other as possible. Which means we've set up a whole way of living that is really based on an error of who I am and what I need. And when we see this, we see that I'm running around with an error about who I am, which includes the notion that I need love from the other in order to be complete. And I've set my whole life up, and I'm living my life moment after moment after moment, based on a set of rules that keeps me very restricted on a biological level. Like I don't do what I feel like. I effectively shut that feeling down because I'm doing what I should and shouldn't do. What my parents have told me to do in terms of work or in terms of relationships, what I feel like I should do because I'm driven by a fear of not having certain things, primarily love, but also money, and living life through these shoulds and shouldn'ts because I think that's the most efficient and best way to do it, without realizing maybe that these shoulds and shouldn'ts actually keep us more and more contracted and make us feel less and less free in life, and without realizing that if we drop all of the shoulds and shouldn'ts, life can still turn out very amazingly, can unfold in a very efficient manner. And because we haven't necessarily experimented, with living life outside of a set of shoulds and shouldn'ts. Our mind assumes, well, if I don't follow these rules, life is going to be chaotic. Everything will collapse, so I have to keep following these shoulds and shouldn'ts. To the extent we start dropping the shoulds and shouldn'ts, we start to be amazed at how much flow there is in life, how much abundance tends to come our way.
So you also said that you learn, well, I don't know exactly how you said it, but it was the idea was that when you started to trust your body to be in the guide, sort of the intelligence of the body, which I think you've said, like, do in each moment what you think or feel you should do. And then sort of the mind lost, I don't know how you said it really, but you said it last night. And that's where I feel I'm like being, that's like the cusp of what I'm, where I'm trying to, I don't know how to say it.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I can talk a bit about that.
Thank you.
So a question that Ramesh would often say is a very good question to ask. After hearing that all of life is predetermined, a story, a creation, and that we are in each moment doing exactly what is destined to happen. So a good question to ask is, well, if all of life is predetermined, then how do I live life? And he would say, good question. In each moment, do whatever you think or feel you should do, with no regrets in the past, no expectations in the future, and no complaints in the present moment. Make a choice, which you then come to see or know as the destined choice. Understand that the outcome is not in your control, so sit back and see what happens. So the key bit is, in each moment, do exactly what you think or feel to do. But if we look at that statement, it's not telling us to do anything in particular. It's not giving you a should or shouldn't. Someone would say, well, it's telling me that I should, in each moment, do exactly what I think or feel I should do. Then when we look at it, it's saying, that's actually a description, not an instruction. It's a description of how everyone is always functioning in life, in each moment doing exactly what they think or feel to do. To the extent that we come to realize that, yeah, this is how life is lived. Life is lived, although it's an unfolding of a predetermined story, the predetermined story unfolds through each person, in each moment, doing or not doing whatever they think or feel to do. Now, to the extent that we find ourselves doing what we think we should do or think we shouldn't do, means that the human being is designed to include all of these shoulds and shouldn'ts. And we know from our own experience, if we start becoming aware of this, that functioning from these shoulds and shouldn'ts doesn't give us the amazing freedom and peace and happiness that we're looking for. That recognition is part of life unfolding, and it's new conditioning. And at some point, we might realize, actually, living this way, by doing what I think I should do in each moment, is my uncomfortableness. And so in my case, at some point, it became very clear that all I was looking for was the end of internal conflict. And when I looked at the internal conflict in my life, it wasn't particularly extreme, it was quite simple. One of the most often or regular forms of internal conflict was when I'd come home from work and I'm tired. All I wanted to, I loved my couch. I loved my couch. It was long enough for me to lie on without my legs sticking off. And I'd get in the door and I'd just flop onto the couch. And it was, I loved it. The problem was I'd get home and then I'd look at my watch and I go, oh, in 5 minutes I have to get up and go and have a shower because I've got an appointment to meet someone for dinner, let's say. And all I wanted to do was lie on my favorite couch. And the idea that I've only got 5 minutes and the time would tick down, now I've only got 3 minutes, 2 minutes, now I've got to get up. So inevitably I'd stay another 5 minutes on the couch and say, okay, now I'll have a really quick shower or something like that. And I realized this is my internal conflict. Not being able to do what I feel like doing and doing what I should do. And when I realized this, I said, well, all I'm really looking for is the end of internal conflict. I'm not really looking for the love of the other. That's secondary, and I was happy to suffer the consequences because it became clear that I had my priorities mixed up. And once I was clear my priorities, the end of internal conflict, that was put on the pedestal. And so I said, I'm going to do whatever it takes in order to bring about the end of internal conflict. And so that meant that I had to start looking at how I was functioning, which meant if I'm tired when I come home from work and what I feel like doing is lying on the couch, I can't have an appointment to go out for dinner. And if I do have an appointment to go out for dinner, I have to learn how to start cancelling that appointment. And so, it's a little hard to do at first, sending a message or picking up the phone and saying, look, I'm really sorry, but I'm tired and I wouldn't do our friendship justice if I went out like this. Can we do it some other time? And there's a skill also that gets developed in how we cancel. So at some point, at the beginning, it's like, damn it, I'm just going to cancel because my priority is this. And so you could just say, sorry, I'm tired, we'll have to do it another time. And that skill develops as to how we realize there's different ways of doing it. But that's beside the point. Reason for mentioning that is that this process is not as disruptive as it might seem. So when I cancel, to my surprise, instead of someone shouting at me for cancelling half an hour before a dinner date, the response often was, oh, this is great, I'm exhausted myself and I'd love to do it some other time. So I found, wow, actually it is working much better than I thought. And at some point it became clear, actually what you have to stop doing is putting in place plans ahead of time. Because you put in a plan and then you come to that time and you find you don't feel like doing it. And this was happening so often that it became clear that life was showing me and telling me, stop planning ahead. Because if you plan ahead, you're getting in the way of the spontaneity and it's not the way to live life. So I went, okay, that's it. I'm not going to make plans. So for a while it's a little awkward. Someone says, would you like to go out for dinner on Friday night? And you go, well, I'm sorry, it's Wednesday at the moment. Friday is a long way away. And I don't know. And also there's ways of saying this as well. Because people don't understand where you're coming from. It's like, okay. That's how much I mean to you, let's say. But this was a very important process. It's how the conceptual understanding starts to be put into action. And the good news is that after getting to a point where I wasn't making plans and doing everything fairly spontaneously, so my couch took on a different role. It became what I call the compass. So I decided I'm not going to move through life until I know what I feel like doing in each moment. And so if the feeling wasn't there to do something, I had to sit on the couch until a feeling came up. And a feeling, this feeling thing is also interesting because I didn't realize that I had no idea how to feel until I started feeling this internal conflict. My awareness landed on it, and that was the beginning of starting to feel. And at some point, it became very clear that I've been living in my head and completely out of touch with feeling in the body. So if someone had asked me, so how do you feel today? I would give them an answer that is from my head. And it maybe didn't really correlate to how I was feeling. And so dropping in and going, oh, how do I feel? And I found there's this whole new place, the body, feeling in the body that I wasn't connected to. And the sense of I am, the sense of being, is never going to be found from here upwards. The spiritual center is said to be the spiritual heart, not the organ, but what's referred to as the spiritual heart. And it's in the chest area. It's where the impersonal consciousness of Source connects to the body and then functions as personal consciousness. And so the spiritual heart is the junction point, where impersonal becomes personal. And in that junction point is the point of I am, the experience I exist. And it's at that point where we come to know our completeness in each moment. And so that's another reason why we have to start doing what we feel like, or at least become very familiar with this area of feeling. That's where we come to know, be ourself. And so anyway, the good news is after some weeks of honing this skill of feeling instead of thinking what I should do, it became very easy to start moving through life. And at some point I started finding that it was safe to start making plans into the future again, on the basis that when someone asked me, would you like to go out in 2 weeks' time, I would feel what the answer was. And I found that if I started saying yes or no from a place of feeling, that when the time came to do whatever I had planned, it felt fine to do it. The feeling was not changing as erratically as it was at the very beginning of the process, which is great now because I have to book things 6 months or a year in advance. And if it was following the same pattern as it was before this process settled in, then I'd be cancelling everything all the time. And I think that's a development. So you can't just jump to that phase of feeling what you want to do in 2 weeks' time, or at least in my process, it needed me to become spontaneous. And then in time, this other aspect developed.
So when you say do in each moment, as a pointer, do in each moment what you think or feel you should do, the feeling part really, I get that part like okay, but the thinking part kind of throws me off a bit because my thinking's not in conjunction with that or aligned with the moment. So
yeah, so think or feel, there are two ways of doing it. And what I found is I have to do what I feel, not what I think. What I think is all the shoulds and shouldn'ts. And so that's the way that humanity can live, or humanity, if life gives us the capacity, can start feeling. So it's not really about doing both. It's choosing. You'll find yourself doing one or the other. Sometimes you'll find in between, you might find yourself flipping between one or the other. But eventually, we'll gravitate to doing what we feel like doing. Now, that requires some clarification, because feeling doesn't mean it doesn't include the faculty of the intellect. The thinking that I'm talking about, the thinking of your shoulds and shouldn'ts, is a very specific type of thinking. It's thinking which is very much based on attachment to outcomes and believing myself to be something I'm not. So the thinking mind. So remember, we can separate the intellect into two distinctions, the thinking mind and the working mind. The thinking mind is the part of the mind that suffering stems from. And it's where the attachment to outcomes exists and the idea of myself as the doer exists in the thinking mind. When the thinking mind dissolves, the working mind is still very functional. The working mind is required in order for life to carry on. So all of this talking is a function of the working mind. When I figure out how much petrol I need to put in the car, or when to call a taxi to pick me up, or what flights to book, or mathematical things and language, all of that is part of the working mind. And that type of thinking is not an obstruction to knowing who I am. So when I do what I feel like, what I find is that it's not just taking into consideration the biological feeling of tiredness or hunger. It's a much more developed feeling. So the final feeling of what I feel like doing in the moment is contributed to by quite a few faculties of the body, including the working mind. So the working mind, the intellect, will look at the options from an intellectual point of view and say, well, that airline ticket is very expensive, but the flight time is very short. That ticket is very cheap, but the flight time is very long. And then we might find one in the middle that is quite low, not as low as the cheapest one, and the flight time is quite reasonable. And so the intellect will look at that and it will say, okay, that's the data. And it puts that data and the assessment of that data into the mix. But because it's the working mind, it doesn't say you should pick any of them. It doesn't say this is the one. It just puts the data into the mix. And then we might have intuition, let's say, is another component that goes into the mix. And intuition, for some reason, is saying, don't fly on Wednesday. And the middle-priced one is a Wednesday flight. And something, your intuition, right, is saying, don't fly on Wednesday. The other two are not on Wednesday. And then another component that could go into the mix is your feeling. You could be really, really tired, let's say, or whatever. And so all of those components, and then at the end, when it's all processed, and you don't have to process it mentally, the mental process was the working mind part, and that's gone into the mix, and then a feeling just presents, and you do that. And that's doing what I feel like. And so that final feeling is something, I don't know what the final feeling is going to be, but it's a combination of a whole lot of faculties of the body. And so that ends up becoming the biological intelligence. If we start feeling what to do, that's what I consider the biological intelligence. And so the feeling could still be to pick the Wednesday flight, even if intuition says, don't fly on Wednesday, simply because the other factors might be strong enough to overrule the part that says don't fly on Wednesday. But it's not an overruling that we do with our head. It's just following the final feeling, and we don't know what that's going to be. It'll be a result of all the little bits and pieces that have gone into the mix. The difference is if we are following our shoulds and shouldn'ts, our shoulds and shouldn'ts disregard any of the other inputs. They disregard the working mind, they disregard your biological feeling, they disregard your intuition, and they say, this is what you should do. This is what's going to be best for you. And so when the thinking mind starts shutting down, we start having access to a way of flowing through life that, to me, is much more intelligent, allows us to flow. Outcomes still, in fact, outcomes tend to be much better. And the way I see it is that that's God's instruction to me in each moment as to what to do. When I was doing what I think I should do or shouldn't do, that was also God's instruction, because it's all God's instruction. But one is God's instruction that will make us feel in flow and surrendered, and the other is God's instruction that is destined to, for a while, keep us believing that we are separate and independent and disconnected.
So, in specific a financial situation that you might like think, I should do this, but everything in you starts to feel like this isn't what you should do. And it doesn't just pass, it just builds and builds. And there has to be some sort of time in between for some faith or something that gets you to stop doing something that's really secure for what you should feel, or what, you know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
Is there anything? And then I'm done.
So the faith is coming to realize that the way that seems, the way that we've related to as the best way to live, because it will give me security, for example. Once we see it doesn't actually deliver what I really want. So seeing that for ourselves and recognizing that it is a result of living life as a result of shoulds and shouldn'ts. That becomes the evidence we need to allow us to change. It's the evidence that makes us braver, so to speak. But at some point, we're not really being brave in doing it differently. We are sort of now forced to do it differently because it just no longer makes sense. Having seen the results of living a particular way, it no longer makes sense to keep doing it that way. So then we find the faith is this movement that says, well, the old way isn't working, so I'm not going to stick to it. Even if on some mental level it seems like appropriate, in practice, it's not working.
Thank you.
Start with the small things first, it makes it easier. Well, just small decisions that we find, oh, I wouldn't normally do this, I would follow my shoulds and shouldn'ts. And we think, oh, okay, let me just start experimenting with the things in life that have smaller consequences, are likely to have smaller consequences. And then at some point you might find yourself, as I did, and I'm not suggesting that this is the way, that it is everyone's path, everyone's circumstance is different. At some point I said, I can't go into work on a continuous basis. I don't feel like it. And at that point there was this trust in this new way of doing things, that I said, I just can't do it anymore. And so I took the risk, so to speak. And that was for a big thing. That was where my conclusion was, if I don't go into work, I'm not going to have an income, which means I'm not going to have a house, which means I'm not going to be able to do this, this and this. And I imagined an alternative solution, like how could I live without an income? And so there was some social security that I thought, okay, I'll accept that social security. And I'll live in a caravan. And the idea of waking up in the forest in a caravan actually was wonderful to me. So to the extent that I imagined for a good 2 months before, is this really feasible? And at some time I thought, this is not only feasible, but this is going to be wonderful. I mean, I didn't have a family and kids, so these are considerations. This is why I say everyone's situation is different. There are some things that I just wouldn't have been able to do if my circumstance was different. But in this case, I looked at the alternative and I thought, I'm going to love waking up in the middle of a forest in a little caravan.
What's a caravan?
A trailer, maybe? Yeah. So my dad had this caravan, you hook it onto the back of your car, and it's got, well, this one was so small, it basically had a bed and that was it. And so I asked my dad if I could have it, and he said yes, and I went and bought the mattress and the knives and forks and cups and kettle, and it was there, it was ready. So I unplugged my alarm clock, and that next day I woke up when I woke up naturally, and when I woke up, I checked to see if I felt like going into work, just one last check, and I didn't. So I didn't go into work, and I went, okay, this, let's wait for the phone call. And it just so happened that I was working as a investment advisor, stockbroker, and there was a system in place whereby we could put orders in after hours if we got something at night. And this was in the early 2000s, so the internet wasn't anywhere near what it is now. So the system was quite basic. And I decided that day I thought I'd get my telephone at work diverted to my mobile. And I did that and started getting some calls through from clients, which is very normal. And some people I said, I can't help you. Can you speak to this other person instead? So I basically passed the clients on to someone else. But for some of the requests, I was able to place the orders through this other system. So I started doing that. And then 6 weeks or 5 weeks passed, and I had to go and get something from my desk. So I went into the office and sort of opened my desk, and my boss saw me and said, "Oh, where have you been?" And I said, "Oh, I've been working from home." And he said, "Oh, okay, carry on," and walked off. And because I was still just meeting my requirements, as in income generation requirements, they didn't seem to have a problem. And so what started off as me essentially thinking I'm not going into work, I'm going to lose my job, turned into a different way of functioning, a way that allowed me to do it from home, that was acceptable. It ended up being acceptable to the company. The business changed, where the clients I started dealing with were different and ended up being a more substantial and a sustainable business model. And so it's another example of how once life pushes us to make this leap of faith, that the outcome is not usually what we expect or what we think. Sometimes we'll get what we want. Ramesh would say in life, we either get what we want, we don't get what we want, and sometimes we get much more than what we want. And I guess that's where trust and faith comes from, when we start seeing this is how life functions.
Hey, will you talk more on all aspects of love, like love of family, child, love of partner, love of self, within the realm of these teachings and concepts?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, love. I don't generally use the word love too much because it's the thing that we're most attached to. Pleasure in general terms. Yeah.
Explain love in your language then.
Mm-hmm.
Give the definition when you're speaking of, when you say the word love, what that is.
Mm-hmm.
And then I guess how we traditionally work or navigate our lives around it or for it or engage in it.
Mm-hmm. So love, as I see it, is the absence of hate, not what we generally consider to be love. What we consider love is much more pleasure. So the love we tend to seek is seeking of pleasure, love that feels good. So love in the context of this teaching is the absence of something, not the presence of something. Well, it's the absence of something that allows our true nature to function. So love is the absence of hate, which really means that when we find ourselves not blaming the other, not blaming ourselves, not feeling proud, and not being attached to how life looks, not being attached to outcomes, the experience is that there is love for life. Not in a way where there is an obvious pleasure feeling, but where there is an acceptance. So love and acceptance and peace, to me, are all interchangeable words. At least that's love in its most basic form, where we allow the other to be as they are, without hating them, without judging them, where we allow ourselves to be as we are without hating or judging ourselves, where we allow life to be as it is, meaning life is this flow that is going to be pleasure sometimes and pain at others. And to the extent that we can find ourselves and know ourselves to be complete, then that knowing ourselves to be complete at all times allows us to not resist life, not resist the other, not judge or hate the other. And so that to me is love in its basic form. And if we're trying to cultivate love in its more complex forms without first finding ourselves able to love life in its basic form, which is acceptance, then I think we're going to struggle for the rest of our life. Because how can we love the other if as soon as they do something that hurts us, we're forced to hate them? And I use the word hate, often it's a very intense word. But if someone parks their car behind you and you can't get out, and you're late for an appointment and it's going to mean you're going to miss the appointment, the blame that we feel for the person for having parked their car there is a form of hate. Even the blame we feel for someone finishing off the milk and putting the empty carton back in the fridge, that's, I hate you for what you've done. So now, hopefully you understand that the word hate is being used in a way where the intensity can vary. But the sentiment of hate is, I hate you for what you have done. That is an attack on who I am. So in the moment when we go to get the milk and the carton is empty, it feels like an attack on my happiness if we are not connected to this part of ourself that is always complete and at peace. And so it's not possible to develop consistent, more complex forms of love if the foundation of not hating the other isn't there. And so we can have the foundation of not hating the other by realizing the other in each moment is doing exactly what they're destined to do, that in each moment the pleasure or pain is what was destined to be there. So then I can see that if pain is delivered to me, it was my destiny for there to be pain in this moment, and the destiny of the other to deliver the pain. And therefore my hatred for them can't be there. The other forms of love that we tend to pursue are probably more accurately described as need. When we say, I fall in love, that feeling is often a feeling that comes because for a short period of time we get what we're attached to. The partner gives us what we are attached to, which is what we need, what we think we need. And then inevitably in a relationship, if we're in the relationship for long enough, it's going to include pain. And as soon as there's pain, this, what we call love, which is really a believed need, explodes into blame towards the other for what they have done to deliver pain to me. And so, there we can start to see the difference between love as I've described it, which is an acceptance and a peace with what is, not hating and not resenting the other, not hating, not resenting myself, not being attached to outcomes, versus a feeling that we call love, which in any moment can turn into blame for the other. That was simultaneous hands going on. And we'll have to go ladies first.
At times I'll experience feelings of maybe anxiety or fear or sadness, and then my mind will start, like she said, start looking for a reason. Why am I feeling this way? And a lot of the time there is no outside reason. Mm-hmm. It's just there. And so I'll practice techniques like, oh, it's not personal. It's something that's coming up in this field, and I'm pretty good at kind of dismissing or cutting off thoughts like, you're feeling this way because. So I'm just wondering, what do you suggest? Like, I don't know if there's a tool, or if I can just say, oh, this is just something that's happening.
Yeah. So all this talk about suffering, right, can easily make us start relating to suffering as something that shouldn't be in life, as a problem. Whereas it's very important to look at the story of life as being a story, an experience in each moment. Life is an experience, like right now, this is life, and this is the experience. That's always what life is. And the experience includes pleasure and pain, and by and large, suffering. Life seems to be an experience of suffering. So in Buddhism, the first noble truth is the recognition that life is suffering. What that means is that this creation, this story of life, has been designed to include suffering. So to the extent that we can witness suffering as a happening, as a content, as a part of the content of the present moment, and understand it to be completely valid. It's completely uncomfortable, but completely valid as part of the creation. It might help to imagine a horror movie is a very valid form of entertainment. It's a very valid film genre. And so it doesn't make it pleasant on all levels. The content is not pleasant, but it could be seen to be entertaining, or at least it's an experience. And life is like that. Life is an experience that is valid as an experience in its totality, and it includes suffering. So if we are using techniques with the attitude of seeing suffering as not valid, then that's the doership aspect, thinking that it has a technique that is its doing and it can control life, and that life essentially needs to be free of suffering. So to the extent that we see that that is what's happening, doesn't make it wrong. It just means that life is including this doership identity, and that doership identity is functioning in that way. And as soon as awareness lands on that, then that dynamic can start to fall away. That's not to say that addressing suffering when it arises is unhealthy. Addressing suffering, if it comes from the right attitude, is super useful. If it is seen to be an arising of a concept based on my genes and up-to-date conditioning. So what you described, where you see suffering and you say, actually, it's not what the story says it is. It's not personal. So that thought, it's not personal, is accurate. And it can be very useful at cutting off the story of suffering that says this is personal. Hopefully, if we see that this is part of the unfolding of life, that suffering was there, that the thought that says it's not personal is a happening according to my genes and up-to-date conditioning that now realizes that it's not personal. But whether the thought it's not personal is actually going to cut off the suffering is not in my control. So sometimes it will cut off the suffering and then we find ourselves in peace. Other times it's going to be destined for the suffering to be there, for the thought to arise, or the technique, if you want to call it a technique, to arise, but for the suffering not to get cut off. And to the extent that we can witness the suffering and understand it to be there, and it's destined to be there, and that it makes sense that the thought is not going to cut it off all the time because I'm not the doer. I'm not in control of the outcome. Then our attitude towards the unfolding process becomes more and more aligned, and the process itself becomes more and more aligned with the general principle that life is a happening, that life will include pleasure and pain, and also peace and suffering, and that my completeness is not dependent on any of that. So even to the extent that suffering arises, it can be witnessed as a happening that doesn't affect what I am beneath all of that.
So, right. So just basically just surrender to that, because that's what's happening.
It's surrendered to that, but at the same time, the functioning of the concepts, surrender to the functioning of the concepts as a happening and not your doing, which means no one here needs to do anything, because life is delivering the conditioning in the form of, let's say in this talk, we're not sure how the conditioning is going to land and how it's going to change or not change our up-to-date conditioning. So really all we need to do is turn up in life in each moment, and in practical terms, do exactly what you think or feel to do in each moment, and recognize that that is not your doing but a happening. So there is no instruction of what to do. The very fact that life is delivering the new conditioning to me is encouraging, because what will happen, not what you do, but what will happen, will very likely be, will be in line with your genes and up-to-date conditioning. That's how we always function. And life is changing, or likely to be changing, your up-to-date conditioning. So what will happen is automatically going to be a happening that is likely to take us closer to peace of mind. Which is why we can relax again. It's like the message again, oh, I don't have to do anything. It's such a load off our shoulders. We've lived life with this idea that I have to do this, I have to do that. And this understanding is potentially the relieving ourselves of a big load of guilt and shame, blame and hatred that we've carried around for our whole life towards ourself and the other. So it's taking that load off, and also getting rid of this load of what I have to do in each moment to keep, the boat afloat. It's totally counterintuitive at first, and then it becomes completely intuitive once the old beliefs about how I have to live life and who I am fall away. Then this other way of just relaxing and allowing, I just need to do in each moment what I feel to do. It's a very simple way of living life. It doesn't make life easy. Life will still have its challenges, but it makes it very simple.
Hi.
Hi, Fritz.
So I find myself disagreeing on a point.
Mm-hmm.
And the use of the word predestined.
Mm-hmm.
Destined makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
Predestined doesn't.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll explain why, and then we can talk about it.
Mm-hmm.
Before, let's say, we follow the model of the Big Bang.
Mm-hmm.
And if you want to even say before that, because I don't even know if you can say that.
Technically, no, you can't. Yeah, and so I understand technically what you're saying is correct. The word pre implies time, and but carry on. I just wanted you to know that I agree on a technical level that you're correct. Yeah.
Yeah, because it's a space/time continuum.
Mm-hmm.
And if there's no space, no matter, there's no time either.
Mm-hmm.
So, boom, everything happens.
Yep.
But to say that it's all planned in advance doesn't tally with my experience.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Because each moment, and I grant also that the I'm not the doer notion is correct. and I've experienced at least what that implies for my experience. In a way, one way I could put it is, why would God straitjacket itself in the first instant of creation? That doesn't make any sense.
Okay. Yeah.
And just from living my life, I know that, again, we're in words here, so my life and all that's kind of silly, but life is influenced by so many things, by so many, if you want to put it in physics term, vectors. There's energies pulling in all sorts of different directions. And I'm influenced by all those things. This life is affected by all those vectors, by all the people that I interact with, if you want to model it that way. So, yes, there's destiny. Things are set in motion. But those things are also constantly changing. So to say predestined doesn't make any sense.
Okay, so it's tricky because so let's start off that life is a paradox, which means there are a surface. So let's look at physics. You've got mechanical physics, Newtonian physics, that is true. And if you look deeper, there's quantum physics. Now, quantum physics, the laws of quantum says mechanical physics is not valid. And yet we find that in practice, mechanical physics, Newtonian physics, is how we live life. We build houses on the basis of Newtonian physics, cause and effect. Whereas quantum physics says there is no cause and effect. And so if we become aware of quantum physics for the first time, because we're mainly aware of Newtonian physics, then we might make the mistake of going, oh wow, quantum physics is truth, because we haven't understood it before. Now we understand quantum physics is truth, and mechanical physics, blah. But we don't live life based on quantum physics. So that's a mistake to say, oh, now this is true and that's not true. The paradox of life is that they both are. It's not this and that, or not this or that, but this and that, the two together. And when we come to see that time and space don't exist from a spiritual point of view, which is a particular teaching that says, so teachings are methodologies. They're not truth. They're there to undo a particular error. The error is another error is when we take a teaching to be truth instead of a methodology. And that's why we're told to treat a teaching as a pointer. Don't mistake the finger pointing to the moon as the moon itself. And one particular part of the process is to shift us out of seeing life based on time and space being the only truth. And it's not the only truth, but it's still a truth. It's part of the paradox. So time and space is true on one level, and spontaneity or spontaneous creation is true on another level. And the two are complementary and coexist, they don't cancel each other out. So everything is predetermined is a concept that does make sense if we can hold that time and space and cause and effect are valid. Then we can start to see why predetermination as a concept does make sense. But if we try and put predetermination as a concept on the level of spontaneous creation, then it doesn't make sense. So that's why it's important to see that we can talk about this subject from top down or bottom up, and they're both valid approaches. If we start mixing the concepts up, then we start getting, it starts being invalid. But to the extent that we keep the concepts in their right places, then it's okay. So let's look at it from the mechanical point that you mentioned, that there's, life is set in motion, but there's so many influences and so many things happening that it's dynamic and not predetermined. So if we take the example of a pool table, and there's the triangle of red balls up the front, and you've got white ball there, and there's someone with a cue in their hand, and they're about to hit the white ball onto the red balls. And before they do, someone says, "Hey, this is a great time for me to demonstrate how everything is predetermined." And the friend says, "What do you mean?" And he said, "Well, the other friend says, I've got this computer here that has been set up to understand the laws of physics, and it is being programmed to be exactly in line with this particular table and these balls. And so tell me at what angle you're going to hit the ball and at what force you're going to hit the ball." And so my friend says, "Okay, I'm going to hit it at this angle, 15 degrees, and with a force of 20 newtons, let's say." So puts that into the computer, presses simulate, and on the computer the white ball and all the other balls are... And then at some point, after 4 seconds or 5 seconds, the image comes to rest. And it's a snapshot. And so it's like, go ahead, hit the ball at 15 degrees, 20 newtons. So it does that, and it all happens. And lo and behold, the balls on the pool table match what is on the computer screen. And so we can see that once it's been set in motion, everything is dynamic. Everything is bumping into each other. And the more complex the example, the more variables there are. But the principle is the same, that everything is following laws of physics or laws of the environment, the closed system. And so we can say not only is it set in motion, but the end result is determined at the point of impact, and everything between the point of impact and the end result is also determined to be exactly as it is. And so from that point of view, we can start to say, oh, okay, predetermined means that the end result that hasn't happened yet was determined by something in time before it. Predetermined then says, okay, from that perspective, I can say predetermined makes sense. Dominoes is another example, is that you hit it and suddenly it stops midway because the gap between some of the dominoes was big enough. So based on the variables, it was always predetermined to stop there. The variables being different, it might have carried on, been a more complex domino unfolding. Where we have troubles with the analogy used and life here is that the doership aspect in us is so ingrained that it says, but there's this factor in life, the human factor, that is not mechanical.
Free will.
Free will. And so thank you for bringing this up. Because when we investigate it, when we look at how the human being functions in each moment, we find that the human being functions in each moment based on their genes and up-to-date conditioning, and that the human being is essentially on a biological level and on a psychological level, a biological instrument. Much different to the idea, the belief we have about ourselves. The belief that we have about ourselves is that on a biological level, no, I am the doer, I am the one that is the chooser, I am the one that is the thinker, and so I am a separate, independent entity, unaffected by anything else. So this is the separation, the idea of a separate me. When we investigate it, we find that the thinking is much less personal and much more mechanical, based on the genes and the up-to-date conditioning. The thought, you shouted out free will, was a result of the circumstance, being the discussion that's being had, and your particular genes and up-to-date conditioning. And so as soon as I said whatever was said, which was a happening, not my doing, a happening according to the genes and up-to-date conditioning and the question that came beforehand that prompted my response, at some point the circumstance was such that you were forced to react or to respond.
Well, let me ask you this.
Can we speak into the microphone for the sake of the recording?
I'm kind of playing on what he's saying because I agree with him. I feel like we would be automaton. They're straitjacketed. If nothing, any decision we made to influence our lives was, obsolete because it's all been done. So I'm just watching.
So this topic needs to come up because this needs to be addressed. I wouldn't. It wouldn't be much of a teaching if it just says, well,
That's the way it
yeah,
is.
too bad. That's your opinion and whatever. So they're very valid points, and there's explanations, and so still the explanations are concepts. The point is you listen to, or you don't. No one, we do whatever we are destined to do, or whatever we feel like. So you can look at it from both angles. The concept is put forward, and ideally we find ourselves investigating or contemplating the concept and deciding whether it holds more water than our existing way of seeing life.
So there was another piece of it.
Mm-hmm.
I don't want to interrupt. Are we good?
Yes, sure.
Okay. The other piece of it is there have been certain events that did very much feel predestined.
Mm-hmm.
There was a time when I was in college, or just after I'd gotten out of college, where I had a dream in the morning about being stuck in the mud in my car, and I was trying to get out and I couldn't, and the mud was flying and all that. Mm-hmm. So I, during the day, forgot about the dream, and I was driving to see a friend 50 miles away. It got dark. It was winter time. I realized I was heading the wrong direction, so I cut into the divider between the two ways on the freeway and got stuck in the mud.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And when then in that instant, I remembered the dream, and I just started laughing.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
That was a strange response, but it just seemed funny.
Yeah.
And there's other things that didn't feel that way at all.
Most of life doesn't feel predetermined, right? It's an experience that's designed to be experienced a particular way. So the reason it's called Maya or illusion is because it's an experience that is designed to feel completely different to what it actually is. Right? So this is why the comment about free will and it's not predetermined comes up, because, and even the very fact of the doer, the sense of the doer, is because the experience is designed for it to feel like I am the doer, for it to feel like I have free will, for it to feel like it's not predetermined. Let's not mistake experience as a reflection of truth, because if we do that, if we take experience on the surface as a reflection of truth, then we say this is how it is. And so if we hold the idea, actually, that's right, we're told in spiritual teachings, life is illusion, and liberation is a seeing through the illusion. So it's expected that we're not going to necessarily be given the feeling it's predetermined. When you do get a situation you described, that's a peak experience. That's a sort of back-scene look at how life is on a fundamental level.
It was kind of wink.
Yeah, that's exactly how we should take it. Is peak experiences are glimpses. They're free samples. Okay, we get to, not of enlightenment, but a free sample of the fundamental nature of life from a particular angle. And so if we start treating peak experiences as that and going, oh wow, I've been given a hint, a wink, that's why we start having peak experiences. So even oneness experiences, where the sense of the individual falls away, the sense of separation falls away, that is so often mistaken to be enlightenment. We think, that's it, this is it, a oneness experience where there's now no subject-object anymore. There is just awareness or consciousness, and everything is arising in consciousness, made of consciousness, recognized by consciousness. And because of so many of the teachings that come before that are pointing at that fundamental nature of life, when it happens as a peak experience, we say, this is it, and then it fades away, and we can be years waiting for it to come back again, thinking that that is enlightenment. It's not. It's a peak experience that is giving us a free sample, a glimpse, and to the extent that we mistake that free sample or glimpse with enlightenment, it means life has put in place an expectation, a misunderstanding, and at some point, hopefully, it clears that up. And we go, I've been expecting enlightenment to look a particular way. And it's not that. And as soon as we let go of that, it's this big relief, because a belief falls away. And liberation is always liberation from beliefs. So let's go back to this topic of, is it predetermined or not? And at the end of the day, we even drop the idea of predetermined. Ultimately, the purpose of the concept of predetermination is to dissolve the existing belief that says, I am the doer, I am in control. So it's predetermined is not a truth. It's a concept designed to undo an error.
Okay, now I'm starting to get what you're talking about.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
So what we can see on investigation is that the idea I am the doer is, well, I say ludicrous for me once I started seeing that it's true that whatever I choose in the moment, the choice I made, is much less my choice and much more a result of these two factors, genes and up-to-date conditioning, that make me what I am in this moment. Two factors that I wasn't in control of, and therefore the reaction and the choice is going to be one way, no doubt about that. But is it my choice as a separate independent entity, which turns out to be a fiction, that there is this separate independent entity that is unaffected by anything else? Or is it a functioning of a biological instrument that is designed and destined to act in each moment exactly the way that we do? So I'm definitely coming back to the free will. This is where it comes in. So part of the experience of life is to include the sense of free will. And we know that's part of the momentary experience. The sense of free will is this feeling that I am completely free to do whatever I want. I am free to raise my hand and ask a question. I'm free to stand up and leave. I'm free to move my hand to the left or to the right. That sense of free will is undeniable. And so this teaching doesn't say you have no free will. It actually says you have complete free will. It says that life is completely predetermined from the beginning of time to the end of time. Everything that happens in each moment is exactly what was destined to happen. So it says that. And then it also says, and you have complete free will in the moment to do exactly what you think or feel to do. And so at first, when I went to see Ramesh, the notion that everything was predetermined before hearing his teachings had been completely seen and accepted by me. And so I was listening to all of this, and I thought, wow, this is exactly as I see life. And then he said to me, and we have complete free will to do whatever we think or feel to do. And we don't have free will. There is no one to have free will. That was my seeing, that thoughts arise, and are they my thought? So even if we don't follow the genes and up-to-date condition, we just come to the present spontaneous perspective, we see a thought arises. Whose thought is it? I've believed it to be my thought, but from a witnessing point of view, thought arises and then action arises. And who is the thinker? Who is the actor? And so the realization in spirituality is that there is no separate me, which is a realization that when presented in a conceptual form like I'm doing now feels completely unacceptable to the me. Right?
Well, I just feel, what is the
Hold on one sec. I didn't mention, you weren't here yesterday. For the sake of the recordings, and the recordings are valuable for those, please let's use...
Sorry.
Here you go.
My voice can carry. Thank you. Shall I talk?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I've heard this before, this idea, the depersonalization of the individual, and I don't buy it, frankly. Neither did Martin Luther King. He loved the individual. Myself, I'm a psychic and a channel. I have contact with friends that have passed, and they are very much themselves. So I really don't buy it that we're just a complete amorphous non-personality. I do understand that we are all branches on this glorious, awesome, inscrutable universe and part of a one. But I don't see the need, and I don't even think it's an empirical value to suggest that the personality is a mistake. To me, it sounds like a typically male thing to want to strip any kind of sentiment or... I don't know. I think it's wrong to suggest there's nothing like me. Because as I just said, my friend Ted, who's gone, who's in contact with me all the time, is very much himself. So if he was nothing and not himself, how could he exist and contact me from the other side?
Mm-hmm. So the concepts put forward here don't say anything about there not being an individual. In fact, what they say is that the human being is...
Sorry, go ahead. I was trying to turn it off, not to interrupt you.
So the teachings or the concepts here say that the human being, Roger, is a result of impersonal consciousness of Source functioning through a particular vehicle, and that vehicle is uniquely designed, based on its genes and up-to-date conditioning, to be personal. And there's two aspects of the human being. There's the biological aspects, which are the personality and the preferences, and on top of that, a psychological entity has also been created, which is part of the human, generally speaking. And that psychological aspect is the aspect that allows suffering to arise. It's the aspect of the human that sees themselves a particular way that, upon certain investigation, if it happens for someone, tends to be seen as an error. Now, it's an error that life has put in place specifically in order for suffering to be part of the story of life. So it's not an ultimate error. It's only an error relative to knowing oneself. And so when the psychological aspect of the human dissolves, the biological is still very much there. And so the personal, the Rogerness, Roger exists. But what doesn't exist is the belief in personal doership and attachment to outcomes. So we start off with the ego, and in this teaching the ego means the person, and the ego doesn't go anywhere. The ego doesn't die, the ego doesn't dissolve. We start off with an ego. Before this transformation, it's an ego with the belief in personal doership and attachment to outcomes, which creates an imaginary separation. And after, if you take Ramana, for example, or any sage that you value, the suggestion is they start off as an ego with the belief in personal doership. The process dissolves the belief in personal doership, so there's still an ego, but now without a belief in personal doership, attachment to outcomes, which means there's a recognition that what I am is what I am as Roger is essentially a expression of Source, and that expression will last for as long as it's destined to last. And so I have no doubt that your experience in life includes communication, if we want to call it that. That communication is something that happens in the present moment. Just like this exchange is happening in the present moment, it's an experience that suggests that there is, what's your name?
My name?
Trisha. An experience that suggests that there are two separate human beings having a conversation. from another perspective, we can witness all of this as an experience in the present moment, and maybe come to see that the separate individuals are not individuals running around in an objective reality, but more part of a momentary experience of a conversation, which is why life is sometimes suggested to be a dream or a rising in consciousness, a creation in consciousness. And the creation is designed to be a creation that appears to be a particular way, this way. And it's sort of saying that the experience is an experience. It's not ultimately real. It's real when we're experiencing the experience. And so when you have communication, it's the experience in the moment. And it's a profound experience. And in this exchange, we can feel all sorts of emotions. We can feel love, we could feel anger, we could feel resentment. All of that is the way the experience is designed. And so in your experience at another particular moment, you might be communicating with a friend that's passed away, and you'll still feel the love, and you'll still feel that there is a communication between two people. I suggest, this is how I started to look at life, as I start to question the concept. So, for example, that he is on the other side, then introduces a notion of a here and a there, which keeps us away from presence with the present moment. And so, this is not to say that, so why not say he's here, let's say?
Okay.
Yeah?
I'm fine with that.
Yeah. But it doesn't make him any more real than you or me. But we're real on the other hand, right? As part of this experience, Roger is different to Trish. We have different personalities and all that. So this isn't depersonalizing the experience. It says there very much is a Roger. In fact, if a teaching says there is no Roger, I would go to lengths to point it out as a teaching to undo something. The belief, particularly the belief in Roger as a reality, let's say. But once it's done what it needs to do, we have to accept, but Roger is still here. And so this creation, which is in these descriptions a creation according to God's will, God or Source has as creative potentiality, which is before the manifestation. In the unmanifest is absolute nothing, but not dead nothing, but potentiality. So at some point it explodes into manifestation. And so the whole of time and space is the creation, unfolding exactly as it's destined to unfold. But how it unfolds is through you and I and everyone else doing in each moment exactly what we think or feel to do. And that's our sense of free will in the moment, to do what I think or feel to do. But when I look at it, I see, what I'm doing is part of the creation. And if we want to get a better example of this, we look at a dream at night that spontaneously arises out of nothing in a consciousness. A whole beach environment, for example, arises and it seems very real, it's experienced as real, and in an instant it can collapse to nothing, and another dream environment that seems very real is experienced as very real, and the characters in the dream feel like I'm in control, this is not destined, that whatever I think is my thought, whatever I do is my action. Whereas when we look at a dream from sort of the outside view, when we understand what a dream is, and essentially we can say that consciousness is lost in the dream or experiencing the dream, there's undeniably the sense that the character has that they have free will, but actually whatever the character in the dream does is completely destined by the dreamer or the consciousness, the imagination of the consciousness in which the dream arises. So the character in the dream might come to realize, if it's destined to, I am just a character in a dream, doing exactly what I'm destined to do, and yet there is this feeling in the dream, which I'm completely grateful for, that I am free in each moment to do whatever I want. So if we can start to see that free will might just be a feeling that we should be grateful for, because if the feeling of free will wasn't there, I would feel like a puppet at the end of a string or a straitjacketed slave, and we don't. And so in a way we can say that life is straitjacketed by the story that has been created, but the freedom and the wonder in life, in my experience, is not to be found in my free will, but in the recognition of what life as a creation is, and therefore the recognition of what I am at my source, which is something much vaster than my old idea of myself. And so when we have issues with the concepts, we sometimes have forgotten the initial question that is suggested at the beginning. It says, ask ourselves, what am I really looking for? And the answer is, I'm looking for happiness. It turns out that human happiness is the absence of unhappiness. Unhappiness in practical terms arises in the form of guilt, blame, pride, worry, and expectation. That's what is our uncomfortableness. The question is that uncomfortableness based on an error or not? And when we look at it, we see that the guilt, blame, and pride is based on the belief in personal doership. I am the doer, the other is the doer. And if that belief is in place, the blame and the guilt has to be there, meaning our unhappiness has to be there. And this teaching is saying the great news is that that belief is an error that has been inserted by life, and an error that life itself will, if destined, undo. And it's on that basis, coming to see that that is an error, that our happiness is available to us, or freedom, or the end of suffering. So Buddha, in Buddhism as I came to know it, is enlightenment is the end of suffering. The cause of suffering is desire. They wrapped it up. Desire really means attachment to outcome, believing that my happiness is to be found in pleasure, pleasure, pleasure. And therefore I desire, those fruits. And to the extent that we continue to defend the doership aspect and the attachment to outcomes, I can't take it personally, because I can see, the way I see it is that that's life unfolding. And if someone is adamant that I am the doer and my happiness is to be found in outcomes, then I say, my attitude is, it's not personal to me, not personal to them even. That's life unfolding. But if we put this question, what am I really looking for? And the answer is happiness, and we find out that my unhappiness is based on these errors, then hopefully you for yourself, not because I say anything, you for yourself will go, firstly, is it true that my unhappiness is guilt, blame, and pride? And the other two, attachment to outcome and worry and anxiety. Is it true? And is it true that it's based on the belief of doership? And hence, do I want to keep defending the doership idea, or do I want to be open and question it? And I know it's tough.
It was a good answer. I mean, I'm definitely going to reflect on it. I'm not utterly sold, but the fact that you converted me at all is impressive.
Good. You might want to repeat that for the recording. Good. I appreciate the questions, because these are genuinely what comes up. They're not, and they're questions that need to be answered. And I know that I had a whole lot of disagreements with Ramesh in my head. No, that's not right. That's not right. I mean, the core of it I had no issue with. Yeah. So the non-doership and that, some other bits I had huge issue with, and that became my suffering, is the mental struggle or the mental arguments I would have in my head with Ramesh, wanting to win, wanting to be right. And at some point I realized I just want to be right. And when I realized that was my suffering, and Grace would come in and show me why what he was saying was more accurate than what I was holding, and it always did that. What he was pointing at was, and what I had issue with, Grace would come in at some point and I would always see, he was right. And the surrender that happened then, and the humility, because sometimes, I would spend weeks arguing in my head, and then at some point I'd realize, I didn't know. And the humility of realizing how much I thought I knew, and then realizing, I was wrong. But in a way where it didn't turn into, shame or guilt, because it was seen I was wrong, because life put that belief in place, and it was going to be there until it collapsed. And so all of the concepts here, all of this talk, is simply because it's relevant to what we're really looking for in life, whether we know it or not, which is continuous unbroken peace of mind, regardless of the circumstance we find ourselves in, which turns out to be, in my experience, and everything I'm speaking about is from my direct experience, not some concept that I've just heard, and direct experience of finding myself living life for many years now, 10 or 15 years, with no suffering arising, regardless of the circumstance that happens. And some of the circumstances I've had in my life fit into extreme financial pain, extreme physical life situations, and unfortunate emotional situations where relationships end and things like that. And yet, what is undeniable for me is that the suffering, which would be forced to arise in the past, no longer arises.
Yeah, that's nice.
I hope this is not off point, but kind of to Trisha's experience of having experiences with people that have passed. You have, I believe, mentioned last weekend that once the body dies, we go back to source or nothingness or oneness or whatnot. And you've also explained reincarnation to some degree and residues or part of the mechanism. Shed some light, if you can, on her experience and many others of being in contact with folks that have passed on, and there still is a communication or a realness to that, and that there might be an existence in the formless.
Okay, that's a whole satsang in itself, and we've run a little over time. So the good thing is that we've got another this afternoon, and for those that come tomorrow as well. So let's break for lunch, and we'll get straight into that answer.